A cover has one sort of defining feature that definitely does sort of call it out, and you see this in other types of advertising art. And I think really a lot of historical painting is designed to be enjoyed when you have a chance to savor it. So you're standing there and you're looking at all the details. Oh, they drew these flowers, they drew these figures. I can walk down the hallway and examine all these different parts of the painting. Yet it looks good at a distance. With a cover, looking good at a distance and being memorable are even more important. There's a couple good ways to make a cover memorable, but mostly they source their power from the world of iconography and design. I think we can all remember the Cyberpunk 2077 cover that's just pure yellow, and that yellow is like a branding element. They use it everywhere. It makes it memorable, and it's mostly that yellow, right? The other colors are subdued and put in, and if you look at my history of cover work, you'll see that as well, that a lot of covers are skewed mostly towards one color. It's easy to talk about, yeah, that blue cover, or that white cover, you know, where it was all white. It gives words to it, but also the brain can just encode that as white, bloody face, that's the painting. And so these simple elements, when something feels iconic like that, it's just good. Icons sort of encapsulate things, which is why I think for a while there was that trend, and I don't know if this got kicked off with Hunger Games, but a lot of books in that genre sort of imitated this, where it was just that pin of the bird for the cover. And these we call them icon covers now. Well, me and the other artists I talk to do. I don't know what art directors call them, but these icon or object covers, in some ways saying something small but profoundly can feel more all-encompassing, like it can capture the whole story than a big battle scene. Because a big battle scene is so specific, so many elements have to lead to that, and at the same time, it's a little generic. War is messy and battles look about the same in some ways. I mean, how can you really care about the specific humans fighting when you can see 20,000 people? If you see one person in front of one big epic tower, it's like, oh yeah, that's a cover. Iconography, I think, is really the key to the game and memorability. Yeah, actually. I don't like blue. I'll be more specific. I don't like really cool blues when you get into sort of the ultramarine area. And the reason is that emotionally, that color has nothing to do with the types of things I'm trying to talk about in my paintings, at least in terms of how we culturally evaluate that color currently. And you can only really paint for your own time period. But I think of it as a whole note blue, this like rich, classic blue of a blue. I went, I just really don't like this. And often clients would ask for a blue thing. You know, I did some counter spells and other types of paintings for Magic the Gathering. They would always ask for it to be a blue glowy thing. I hate this. I don't want to paint this. But around the same time, I was reading a book that I reference often called The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. And in there, he talked about this idea in martial arts of learning X from Y. In that example, he would say, you can learn the hot from the cold. Who knows water better than a man dying of thirst? I think these are sort of quotes from the book. But the general principle he's getting around to is, you can often learn in the guise or the sort of area of something else. It seems like a very simple, that little side thing probably wasn't necessary to explain how I got there, but just to give a glimpse into the thinking, I thought, okay, well, I know I like some paintings that are blue, which means it's doable, but I'm making some sort of thematic error repeatedly where I can't like my own blue paintings. So how am I going to solve that? So I basically looked up all the painters I knew of that had used blue in a way where I liked their paintings. And then what I found was they were kind of muddy, or they were greenish. They were beating that blue up. I was just always, when someone said blue, it was a foible of mine. I would internally picture this pure, rich blue and assume that's the blue they meant. But there's so many colors that could qualify as blue. Once I figured that out and was able to start using sort of muddier, greenish blues and not color balancing my blues to be so hue, pitch perfect, I was able to like them a lot more. I'm trying to think of a painting recently where I used blue in that way and put a lot of green in it. The end papers for the blade itself is this long shot of Adjua over the water. It's sort of like an establishing shot for the whole series. And that painting has a lot of green in it. So that's maybe one. Everybody has a bunch of little monkeys that sit on their shoulder and talk to them as they paint. And usually those monkeys' heads look like their teachers' heads. So I hear all kinds of funny little things. Greg Manchess once said, when in doubt, rub it out. So like I've got all these parts of the painting where I'm like, this edge, I just can't get it right. oh, it's because I'm not even supposed to be working on this edge, and then I'll just blast that edge off into a soft edge, and yeah, that usually solves it. But if it doesn't, then that's not the right technique for that. Now, luckily in the computer, you can just hit Control Z. So it's good for someone like me that's experimental in that way. I want to be able to go, oh, what about this? Oh, what about that? And then reel it back. I think one of the best principles is an amalgam of a thing I've heard from many different people, and this is that the maximum amount of contrast with the lowest amount of elements is usually going to really sing. For instance, when you look at a good sci-fi outfit, what makes Star Wars outfits so much more special than certain kind of other sci-fi where it's all mechanical, it's all skin tight? It's the natural contrast. You've got fabric that's old next to metal that's new, next to fresh-faced person who's full of optimism, and that's a lot of history and world building and elements all in one. But it's really simple to just be like, oh, your costume sucks, add a cape. It shouldn't just always be a cape, right? But it's a good basic principle. I see the same thing with edges. If you can get a bunch of soft edges and then one little sharp one, that's really gonna sing. If you have a bunch of different colors that are cool and then you put one little pop of red, that's really gonna sing. It goes back to that sort of yin and yang principle that I mentioned earlier. It's related to your ability to call on different things in the orchestra of your painting. You go, oh, woodwind's quiet right now. This is timpani's time, and timpani might be red, right? So you're calling that color up to kind of be more special. But choosing, you're not just saying, oh, wow, that's crazy, the red turned out to be special. You can choose these things and you can design them. Maybe one other one that jumps out to me is just that everything is drawing. And that's another one that's kind of like an amalgam of many things many people have said before. It's nothing original. If something in a painting doesn't feel good, it's probably poorly drawn. I remember that, I think it was Hawthorne on painting. It's a little tiny book. Hawthorne he had his own school, and a lot of his writings and critiques to students, and even sometimes referencing accompanying paintings that you can still look up on the internet, are in this book that was collected by his students and I think his wife after his death. And he said in there, you know, I'll often ask people if they can ever think of a piece that was poorly drawn, but it was a good composition. And they never can. It's just always important to draw well. So those are some of the big principles. The last one I'll mention, and I don't think this is the biggest one I think of anymore because it's subconscious for me now. I had to be taught it. Usually you want to have a concept of values in your painting that's Z-depth oriented. So in the painting, we're not just thinking this way and this way. We're also thinking this way. So as you're thinking front to back, you see this a lot in old masters paintings, and sometimes it gets called chiaroscuro, sometimes it gets called other things, but basically this artificial idea that the further away something is, the white is less pure. If you're painting a sky with white clouds, and in the foreground you've got a figure wearing white, the white in the figure should always have a higher cap, should get brighter than the white in the far clouds. Even if in reality, if you looked up at those clouds, they might blind you because there's not just white, it's like UV light pouring into your eyes, and sometimes it's hard to look at clouds. As the artist, you're telling the viewer, you are looking at this figure. You're not looking at the clouds. So you don't leave it up to them. You decide, and then you control your values in such a way that things move backwards and forwards quite naturally and have a type of encased logic to them. And that makes the paintings really feel good. And the reason is because you're doing a lot of the work for the viewer. If it's easier to look at, it's usually considered to be a better painting. These days, it's a hybrid of technical and story elements that I want to include. When I say story elements, I mean the ferocity of a specific character might be the subject more than even the character herself. You know, and before I give other examples, I would say on the technical side, it's like it has to be well drawn, it has to be well painted, and then I think it also has to be well designed for me. If the designs aren't at a good level, it's going to be hard for the painting to really sing. And one of the reasons is that it just sort of lacks naturalism. Humans design their environments so carefully. They design everything. This hoodie is designed, the pants are designed, this ball jar is designed, the camera stand, everything. It's branded, it has features that are supposed to make it more or less useful or look good even. You know, we want things that look good and are simple and minimal, or sometimes we want the exact opposite. We want that rococo, big, hardworking, you know, everything's playful, but there's a ton of it kind of. You know, when you look at someone like Drew Struzan, a lot of his work really benefits from the fact that he's working off set photography and costume photography and all these things that tons and tons and tons of humans put their effort into designing and making feel believable and natural. And if you don't do that for your illustrations, it's just a little bit of a missed opportunity. Now, of course, when you're just getting started, you can't think of everything under the sun. And I often had that as a neglected area in my own painting. But these days it's more important to me, and I take a lot of enjoyment in the design. There's sort of like always a list of technical criteria you're trying to hit, but then from a story point of view, I'm looking at human power, human capability. I just really believe in people and what they're capable of when they put their mind to something, and if that can be embodied through a physical action like a backflip or sort of an all-out action when you paint an action where if you asked a model to do it, they would say, this hurts to do. It's like, well, a human can only do that for 1 second, right? That full arc on the backflip or the maximum dip back when they're doing a dodge, like when Neo's dodging bullets, you know, and he's that huge apex movement. Seeing that for a long time in that bullet technology, or bullet time camera. That was so awesome. Not imitating that, but using moments like that to talk about human capacity, human vigor, our fortitude. I think those moments are big for me. So there tends to be a real focus on characters. And when I'm asked to work on other elements, like paint these 3 spaceships in front of a moon or something like that, often in that case, I'll lean more on my technical specs. Is it well designed? Is it well composed? Is it well painted? But if I can give it some feeling, I mean, I think John Harris is somebody that does spaceships in front of planets. They just have such feeling, and maybe I need to push a little more in that area, I'm not sure. But yeah, as a director, I'm very person-focused, I'd say, these days. If I take out the word motif, then I would just say definitely. Ideas don't work all the time. A motif idea, it's hard to know exactly what the asker means by that, but I would just take a guess at it and say, if the intent is to say, have you ever had an idea for a design or a sigil or a way that a cover could be? For the Red Rising books, I did this, I guess I'd call it a motif of figures in poses standing in front of these carvings that were showing mythological figures that in some way represented the figure that was standing in front of them. That motif, if that's what you want to mean by that, worked out pretty well. But I've definitely had tons of ideas for book cover looks or design looks that, yeah, they don't pan out at all. And you just move on. The good ideas fight for themselves. Sometimes you have to get in there and say, Hannah, I don't think you're appreciating this idea. Let me tell you why this idea. But of course you have to do it with deference, and you have to try to champion it in a way that's positive. You can't say, you're missing the point, or, oh, art director, you don't understand me. That's such a bad mindset to have. Let the ideas fight for themselves, and when they need a little help, help them. There's a lot of duds. Around here somewhere, there's a screenwriting book called Story by Robert McKee, and in there he basically said that the difference between a great writer and a bad one is just knowing what to burn. There's a lot of burned art and motifs. Things that are floating around in the painting. So if it's flower petals, snowflakes, embers, I will move around every single one individually. I remember I went to the illustration masterclass way back now, 2014, and Mike Mignola, who did Hellboy, was there, and he was obsessed with it too, and I felt so validated. I was like, yeah, somebody else gets it. And he was saying, sometimes when I can't figure it out by design, I'll literally just close my eyes and think of the painting, and then I'll open them, and before they're even fully open, I'll just dab 3 or 4 dots on the painting, and those will be the little bits of paper. And he said, I can almost never beat that. Similarly, in the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Suzuki talks about how difficult it is to arrange your dots on a piece of paper out of order. I feel that's true. So you want them to feel they're falling naturally with these rhythms of nature, but they also have to support the overall composition of the painting. And a lot of students that I've had go, wait, you're saying the white dots of the snowflakes can balance the composition? And yeah, they're the smallest little dots of white that can be seen from a distance. They totally have an effect on the composition. I've seen paintings that wouldn't work without a single snowflake, but that artist did put in a single snowflake, and the painting just sings. You tend to find that you're decent at what you obsess over. When I look at someone else's painting, I can go, you take out this flower and it's good. But then there's other things I should probably obsess over that I've had to learn to obsess over. Ultimately, I don't think there's anything in your painting you shouldn't obsess over, right? In Schmid's Alla Prima, he says, you should never intentionally leave anything wrong on your canvas. Sounds like a recipe for obsession to me. It does change from project to project. I don't know if just a spoken format is the best way to answer this, but I will try to give a description that is based more in principles than in, because I can say, oh, sometimes I do this way, sometimes I do that way, but it's not really that helpful. The principle of how I decide what the process will be like is, what look are we after? Sometimes when I'm working on a AAA video game, they want it to look like colored pencils when you're up close, because they're going to print this on a huge banner, and they need it to really hold up and be interesting, or they're trying to emulate a specific artist's general look or style or a genre of look even. So in that case, my method is very much slaved to art history. What did that artist do to get their work? And then there's research that can back that up and kind of show you, oh, they did this, they did that. Having a broad command of different techniques is the most important thing, so that when you come to any specific painting, you can sort of grab pieces at will and put together what you need to put together. The driving principle of the computer, what makes it good as an art making tool that is not that true in other mediums, is I think of it as the power of registry. So when you're doing a printing press, you gotta like make sure that it's registered properly, so that when you put down another color, it sits exactly in a place that's relative to the first color, so that your lines aren't weird or overlapped or misregistered. Photoshop and other drawing programs have perfect registry, which means if I have, say, reference in my file, a photograph that I'm wanting to take a little part of, then I can just turn the photograph on and draw right over the photograph. And then when I turn the photograph off, well, the art is perfectly registered to the piece already. And then I can add color underneath that drawing, for instance, and it's instantly perfectly registered. There's a lot of fun and cool tricks that come from that type of exactitude when it comes to registry, and they're all quite useful. For instance, when you're a traditional painter, sometimes if you're working with reference, you might use a projector, I know a lot of artists use, or some other way like a light box. You have to get that perfect registry, and if the paper moves, things get off a little or whatever. It's not like that in Photoshop. That provides a really strong base for how do you build your files. There's also the ability to just say screw all that and just paint all on one flat layer in the background. And personally, when I'm painting for fun or lower sort of stakes projects that don't have to be delivered as layered assets, that's how I'll prefer to paint. I guess that's a good base. You have to draw well, but that's not a technique. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that in sort of spoken form, but maybe we can call it there. I can't hear the term rules of thumb without thinking of that scene in Boondock Saints where the worker at the meat factory is screaming about what rule of thumb means, and then she gets in a fight with the two guys. But beyond that, there's so many different thoughts and schools of composition that it's maybe difficult to answer, because I think the most important thing is to have a broad grounding in every different school of composition and thought that you can get your hands on. The best way to study this that I've found is to find pictures you think work but that shouldn't work, and then figure out why. So you kind of want to reverse engineer. I was teaching a class and I was teaching about a compositional principle basically that I think of as pattern, where it's how are the blacks and whites arranged in the image in an abstract way, not just the pure blacks and not just the pure whites, but if you take me, for instance, and you reduce every color, you push it in your mind so that it has to sit either in the whites or the blacks. Well, this is pretty easy, right? This sits in the whites. The chair would probably sit in the whites. These reds, though, they're more in between. They might actually sit in the darker values. Some colors back here might sit in the darker values. This black stripe would sit in the darker values. When you abstract the entire painting into just black and white, is it interesting? Is it laid out nicely? And mostly, is it interesting comes down to just simple sort of yin-yang. There's a big dark area, and put a little light in it, and vice versa. And trying to always have variety. If you have a shape that's this size in the middle and you're painting me, and the chair is the same size and the same color, maybe you make the edge of the chair softer, or maybe you shrink the arm in your painting so that it's not all so samey. You don't want that sameness ever, really, as an artist. You want natural flow and rhythm, those sort of pathways that the eye can follow that are naturally fascinating. So there's a lot of ways to get there, but I was teaching about that concept of pattern, and one of the students showed me a James Jean painting that she felt worked, but didn't follow any of those principles. I was like, yeah, it sure doesn't. And I spent some time really after that delving into a lot of different artists' work, looking for all the other ways, because, of course, that was an early way that I was taught to think about composition, and it works. There's so many ways. I think the less systematic you can be, the better. But ironically, the good way to not be systematic is to know as much as you can and to study all the different systems. So that would be my advice on that. When you ask about landscapes versus figures, I would say really they're one and the same, in that your focal point will determine what composition makes sense. So if the focal point is an interaction between two figures, then you've got kind of an abstract gesture there. You can't base the lines of movement off of just one of those two figures, or it will feel like that figure is dominating. In a landscape with a castle, say, maybe you see this a lot, that main tower moving up has clouds that sort of encircle it, and you're seeing three-point perspective where everything seems related to that tower somehow. that's going to really naturally make that feel like a focal point, and it's going to give it all this sort of epicness, but it might also feel a little done before. So how can you counter that and add a little variety? But also, you could take the same painting and make a figure in the foreground who's fighting the focal point. What are you asking the viewer? What are you telling them even to look at? You shouldn't really be giving them much of a choice, as an illustrator especially. And if you're telling them, look at this figure, then maybe the clouds are sweeping in a diagonal where their tips kind of gently point down towards the figure. It's really up to you, and I don't think there's any super hard and fast rules, but for myself, and maybe for you, just having all the ways at your disposal so that when the time comes, you just do them instinctively. And this is one of the reasons why piecemeal art is really difficult, because you do a sketch and all the clouds point at the figure and they say, great, change that figure to point the other way and it's approved. And you go, oh, but it's difficult, right? So you got to make these other changes and not go, oh, but I couldn't because the clouds. It's like you just have to be good enough to change everything, which means you might need a whole new system. But the more systems at your disposal, the better. Knowing what your focal point is and if it's been changed is the other key.